Welcome to Politically Georgia from the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. I'm Greg Bluestein here with Patricia Murphy. Hey, Patricia.
Hey, Greg.
It is poll week. It's always a fun week of analyzing the AJC UGA poll and all the findings, but this one just seems like it's been more anticipated than ever because I've been blown up by readers and by candidates and by campaigns and by operatives about like what the poll is going to show, when it's going to show it.
Yeah, also, I feel like with the governor's race and the Senate GOP primary, there has not been a lot of polling. It feels like it's been a bit of a polling desert up until now. We, of course, had our poll earlier in the year, but not anything super fresh. And then there has not been the typical sort of storm or flood of outside polling that we do sometimes see here in Georgia. So I feel like we've all been flying a bit blind. So getting this poll, and it is extremely reliable, 1,000 likely voters on each side of the aisle. So I think we've got some great data, not just about candidates, but also about topics, voter attitudes. We've got a ton to unpack.
Yeah, well, today we're diving into the second half of the AJC's new primary polling. Last week we talked about the Republican side. Now we've got the Democratic side of the 2026 race for governor. And the biggest takeaway is this: Democratic voters are in a very different place than Republican voters right now. They're anxious about the country. They're pessimistic about the direction of Georgia. Clearly, obviously looking for change. And for now, they're coalescing behind the best-known name in the race. That is former Atlanta Mayor Keisha Lance Bottoms. Patricia, our poll shows that Bottoms has a clear lead in the Democratic primary for governor. She's at 39%. That's far ahead of Michael Thurmond, who's at 10%, Jason Esteves at 8%, Geoff Duncan at 7%. They're all kind of in a muddle in the race for the second spot in the likely runoff. But this race is not over. About 35% of likely Democratic primary voters say they still don't know who they're going to support. Huge opening. Bottoms is all but guaranteed a spot in the runoff, but the question is, who would she face, and can she avoid a runoff altogether?
I think, can she avoid a runoff is a huge question at this point. She has not put a ton of money into TV. In fact, she has only spent $49,000 on TV. Compare that to the tens of millions that Republicans are spending over in their primary. So she's really had to do very little to stay in cruise control at the top of this field. If she were to put a lot of money in, even a significant buy-in between now and primary day, she could avoid a runoff. However, because she has such high name ID and there's such a large undecided field, that tells you that a lot of voters know exactly who she is and they're choosing not to vote for her. And so that to me presents a huge opportunity for Thurmond, Esteves, and Duncan, but because the margin of error is 3% on this poll, they're all within the margin of error to get that second spot against her.
Yeah, this is where campaigns and candidates matter. You know, they always matter, but this is really where they matter because it is such a muddle. It is basically a toss-up of who could get into that runoff if there is a runoff. And I still think all things are pointing towards a runoff.
Yeah.
But Geoff Duncan, he's just going on there in the final stretch of the race. Jason Esteves, he's putting more money into his campaign TV messaging. Michael Thurmond, he's been in a pretty decent second place-ish position for most of the race. We can't say he's in second place because he's within the margin of error, but he has always been part of that jumble. Our October 2025 poll also showed him with about 10% of the electorate. But what he does these final few weeks matters too. And we know they're going to be all over the campaign trail. But most of them are sticking to the metro Atlanta area because, of course, that's where the bulk of the Democratic likely electorate lives.
This is definitely when you get into just a question of volume. How many voters can you get in front of if you're a Democratic candidate? They really need to get their name ID up. And sometimes that's just by doing hand-to-hand ground game stuff, knocking on doors, shaking hands, going to large events, and just getting your face and your name out there. Michael Thurmond has been going all around the state. I know he'll be outside of the Atlanta area this week as well. All these candidates have been going around the state. Thurmond seems to be spending the most time outside of the city of Atlanta, but also that's because he's very well known inside the city of Atlanta. Spent so much time leading DeKalb County. I think that he knows that he's going to be strong there, and other places around the state are where he could really take advantage of being a previous statewide candidate as well.
Now, we've been saying that Keisha Lance Bottoms, is likely headed to a runoff, but we haven't been saying it's a sure thing, only because 40%, you're kind of, on the edge of striking distance to winning this race outright. Now, if Keisha Lance Bottoms had like $5 or $6 million on the air right now, or, if it was a different sort of sentiment right now, maybe her rivals would be worried more about an outright win by Keisha Lance Bottoms, and you'd start seeing them attack her more. Right now, though, we're not seeing that at all. Patricia, really the only head-on-head collision we've really seen was at one of the debates where Jason Esteves questioned Keisha Lance Bottoms' mayorship, her tenure, specifically when it came to the death of Sequoia Turner, the 8-year-old who was killed outside that burnt-out Wendy's in 2020 during the height of civil unrest around police-involved shootings. But we haven't seen that all-in attacks on Keisha Lance Bottoms, signaling that either they have their own polling that shows she's also around 40 but not closer to 50, or that they're focusing on their own campaigns and worried that if they do attack Keisha Lance Bottoms, it might help them, but it also might help one of their rivals.
It might help one of the rivals. I think they also worry that they might hurt themselves by going after Keisha Lance Bottoms. And I've asked a lot of strategists about this. I'm like, I do not understand why nobody is going after Bottoms, either on the air, in mailers, or even at just some of these forums. You did, obviously, Jason Esteves recently did in that debate, but Bottoms has not been forced to answer for a lot of things yet. And I think that she has an immense number of potential negatives that have not yet been addressed, and in some cases exploited by potential rivals. But by going after Bottoms, strategists have told me you risk looking like the bad guy. You risk looking like somebody who's not a loyal Democrat if you're doing that. Geoff Duncan in particular would have a really hard time going directly after Keisha Lance Bottoms because he's a recent arrival in the tent. And going after an individual Democrat right now just might not be a good look for him. So it really has set up the situation where Bottoms has just been in cruise control at the top. The only person to spend any money against her is Rick Jackson over on the Republican side of the ticket.
Yeah, and he's happy to go attack her.
So happy.
And it just shows you where Republican minds are right now. They think that she will be the eventual nominee, but there's still a lot of election left to go. Patricia, let's dive deeper into Keisha Lance Bottoms' numbers because what was, I think, one of the biggest takeaways, 44% of support among black voters. That's by far the highest number among African-American voters for any of the candidates. And of course, black voters are the beating heart, the dominant, the backbone, you name it, the foundation of the Democratic electorate, accounting for most of the votes among likely Democratic voters. That tells you a lot about where her strength is going from. I do keep on going back in my own mind to the 2020 Senate primary, where there was a lot of talk about, a runoff between Jon Ossoff and Teresa Tomlinson because he was showing at some of these polls around the 40-ish% mark. And of course, we know what happened there. Jon Ossoff ends up winning a majority, I think 51% of the vote, and avoids the runoff and is able to consolidate Democratic support heading into his matchup against David Perdue. Then I also think of a different race, the 2018 race for governor, where Casey Cagle was like the front runner from the get-go, never trailed in any of the polls, was polling about 43%, most polls going into the final stretch, ended up right around the 40% mark. And of course, that meant a runoff against Brian Kemp, and we know what happened there.
Yeah, I do feel like because she's already got high name ID, this represents voters staying on the sidelines and not yet making up their minds about Bottoms and maybe looking for an alternative to Bottoms. So I think the chances of her getting out of this without a runoff it's just so hard to say. I'd love to see more polling and more in-depth polling about kind of specific voter attitudes. I guess you'd have to get into a focus group actually to understand a little bit better about how they're feeling about the mayor. She's also been able to take advantage of a really smart free media strategy. She's released her memoir in the middle of this campaign, a week before early voting started, and that came with a rollout with a big appearance on Morning Joe, on MS Now. She had a big excerpt in Rolling Stone magazine. President Joe Biden just endorsed her. Some people might not think that's a good thing. However, among the Democratic base, they do think that's a good thing. It also would be strange for Biden not to endorse somebody who played such a prominent role in his administration while she did, had an office right there in the West Wing very close to the president. So it would be unusual if he didn't endorse her. So she's been able to roll out a number of things that have not required her to spend any money, and it's helped her, I think, quite a bit. Also, when we see her at events, she's really turned the page from being mayor. She doesn't talk about that a whole lot. When she does, she talks about what she's proud of from being mayor. Even in her opening statement in the Democratic debate, she did not mention being mayor. She talked a lot about President Trump and looking toward the future and how she wants to fight for Georgia. And she's been in these fights before against the Trump administration, but very little conversation about her time as mayor in her sort of opening statement to introduce herself to voters. She's very relaxed, very confident. She gets a great reception when she's at these events. And so she's proving to be, I think, also a strong candidate, along with not a single person trying to land the glove.
That's a very good point. And it's also, what happens when you get in the race as early as she did. She's been in the race for months, I think about almost a year now.
Yeah.
Or at least we've known she's running for about a year now, which means she's been able to answer a lot of those questions over and over again. Why didn't you run for a second term? Why didn't you do this in your first term? Why didn't you do that in your first term? Just much like Geoff Duncan's been able to, it still doesn't mean those questions go away, but he's been out there on the campaign trail talking for more than a year now, it feels like, about why he was wrong in his view on abortion or Medicaid expansion, guns, religious liberty, all these issues that he backed as a Republican lieutenant governor that he's now disavowing as a Democratic candidate for governor. Let's dive deeper into these numbers too for the other candidates, because look at the independents. Keisha Lance Bottoms, 38% of independent support. So she leads in every category of any of this. But it's interesting because Geoff Duncan, he's at 12% of the independent vote. Jason Esteves, 10. Michael Thurmond, 6, right? This is a smaller subset, but it shows you, of course, Geoff Duncan, he's getting those independent voters who, maybe even backed him in his lieutenant gubernatorial bid way back in 2018, but also might see him as the most electable candidate. The problem for Geoff Duncan and any other candidate relying on independent votes is that A, they're less likely to vote in a Democratic primary, even though these independent voters say they are. And B, you've got competition across the aisle because Republicans also have a very, very heated race for governor and Senate also on their ballot. And you've got candidates like Brad Raffensperger and Chris Carr who are also appealing to, and Derek Tooley, who are also appealing to those independent swing voters.
Another problem for Geoff Duncan, if as strong as you can be with independent voters, you still have to be very popular with the Democratic base, and he's not there yet. And I think that an attack that I recently saw from Michael Thurmond against Geoff Duncan got a huge applause at a forum. He said, listen, if you're converting to a different church, we welcome you to church. We're glad you're here. You are not going to be the senior pastor the day that you convert to a different religion. You need to sit in the pews and pay attention for a while before you think you're going to be in charge around here. And that was a very welcome message from the people in that room. So I think Duncan continues to have work to do to not only convince people that he is a Democrat, but that he should lead the Democrats. And I think he's struggled, I think, with some more base audiences to do that. Again, they're like, well, welcome aboard. However, there are real consequences from the legislation that you pushed as lieutenant governor. And in fact, that's why all of us are running for governor, is because of what you did in that position.
Yeah. Jason Esteves is the clear number 2 among white voters, of course, a smaller proportion than black voters. He's at 17% among white voters, compared to Keisha Lance Bottoms, who's at about 26% with white voters. 41% of white voters are undecided. We're talking about that only because of course, there has to be a biracial coalition, a multiracial coalition for any Democrat to win. And generally, it's been looked at as like what the 30 magic marker, like a 30% white turnout for Democrats can help get Democrats over the finish line, although there's evidence that you don't need to get to that 30% mark anymore in Georgia politics. Look at Michael Thurmond. His strongest base of support still far trails Keisha Lance Bottoms, of course, but among moderate and conservative voters. To the extent there are conservative, likely Democratic primary voters, there's a small number of those, but 13% back Michael Thurmond. That is the easy second place behind Keisha Lance Bottoms, and 14% of moderates back Michael Thurmond. Again, easily in second place, far ahead of Geoff Duncan and Jason Esteves among moderate voters. And that's kind of always been Michael Thurmond's pitch to voters, which is that he is more a centrist in many ways.
And he has said many times he wants to be a governor for all Georgians, for Democrats, independents, and Republicans. And he would want to have Republican input on his policies. He wouldn't want to run the state as a hard partisan. He would want to run as sort of his own leader. And I think that's, obviously a very welcome message among moderate and conservative Democrats. I think it also gets to why I was speaking to a senior Republican over the weekend who said, the guy we really don't want to run against is Michael Thurmond. They feel like he has not just the name ID and kind of the broad statewide appeal, but also that message is one they feel would be very difficult to run against in a general election. So they're real excited to run against Keisha Lance Bottoms. Maybe that's not a wise instinct on their part, but they really have said they would rather not run against Thurmond because they think he'd be real tough in November.
Well, let's take a quick break. When we come back, we're going to go deeper on the Democratic electorate from their unified front against Donald Trump to the economic anxiety driving this 2026 midterm. This is Politically Georgia from the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. Welcome back to Politically Georgia. Greg Bluestein here with Patricia Murphy. Patricia.
Greg.
We here at the AJC are gearing up for something really special. It's our first ever AJC subscriber week. We've done a lot of events, but this is different. To kick it off, we're hosting a Politically Georgia happy hour at Manuel's Tavern, our favorite, on May 15th. Patricia, me, and Tia, she's coming in from Washington.
Oh, good.
We'll be talking through what's ahead in the primary, possible runoffs, November's election, all your questions. Come have a drink, bug us with lots of questions, join our conversation. The event is exclusive to AJC subscribers. We'd love to see you there. I think we've also amplified it on our social media feeds as well.
We definitely have. And I love these kinds of events. We do some more formal events, sort of specific interviews, candidates, a very tight run of show. This will be a lot more relaxed and a great chance to interact with our subscribers.
And buy
so
Patricia
become one today.
Many, many beers.
I don't drink, so you can buy me a Coke.
There you go. I was at a few events over this past weekend, and several folks came up and said, we can't wait to see you. And I almost forgot it was happening. So
yeah, I'll see you there.
The news has come out. I need to remind my wife that I will not be around Friday night.
Well, she could come.
Ferry our kids around.
They can all come.
Yes, we can tear Nicole away from one of her parties and just have her sit. She will like that, actually. Yeah, maybe we can make it like meet the wife and kids. It'll be great.
Totally.
Now back to the poll.
Sell some tickets.
The Democratic governor's race is just one part of the story. We talked last week about the Republican side of the horse race, but this poll goes much deeper, Patricia. We always use these as excuses to gauge the mood of the electorate on so many different issues. And the broader numbers really tell us a lot more about the mood of the Democratic electorate, is specifically dominated by three different things: Donald Trump, economic anxiety, and a desire for government to step in more aggressively on emerging issues like AI and data centers. And I know you've been writing a lot about this.
I sure have.
Let's start with Trump, though. If Republicans are organized around their support for Trump, showing 80% plus backing of him and his agenda, Democrats are just as unified by opposition to him. The poll shows 92% of likely Democratic primary voters strongly disapprove of Trump's job performance, and the opposition is just as intense on his handling of the economy, immigration, and the war against Iran. That is a remarkable level of intensity. It means Trump is not just unpopular with Democrats, he's like the central villain, as he has been for pretty much every election in the last decade among Georgia Democrats.
Yes, I think also we're seeing national polling that indicates independents and even some Republicans are deeply wary of the president's policies right now. And I think that is going to be especially important to the Jon Ossoff race. I think because he is a federal official, and of course, obviously to the House races as well, because he's a federal official, that November contest with Jon Ossoff against an unknown Republican at this point will come down to, do you want more of President Trump's policies or less of President Trump's policies? Ossoff is positioning himself as a very clear check on the president's powers and imploring people to vote for him because if they could get a Democratic Senate, keep him in there and swing some other Democratic seats, that would represent an entirely new world for the president to be operating within. And I think that's also why Ossoff has been so unapologetically against the president since before we saw this kind of polling. His very first, as he calls them, his rally for the Republic, right after President Trump was reelected here in Georgia, Ossoff came out incredibly aggressively against him. I didn't know at the time if that was going to be smart politics for a freshman Democratic senator in an election cycle, and events have proven that that has been smart politics. I also think it's also how John Ossoff feels about the president, and he's in very good company among Democrats.
Yeah, I mean, especially for a Democrat who has to rely on winning at least some Trump voters to win re-election. And you're right, he made that gamble or that bet. I don't know, he probably doesn't see it as a gamble or a bet, but he made that calculated decision very early. And this poll shows, look, 92% strongly disapprove of Trump overall. That is the way Democratic emotion and sentiment is feeling. And just as many, a huge number of independents are also feeling that way too. And those are the sort of deciders that will help decide this election. Patricia, it also showed that the top issues, inflation, cost of living, healthcare, economy and jobs, the bottom issues, immigration, abortion, crime, among likely Democratic voters, incredibly pessimistic outlook. 79% say the economy is only going to get worse. Young voters tend to be the most pessimistic. So if you want to use this as sort of a barometer on where things stand among Democrats, the outlook is dim, obviously very anti-Trump, but also very against the different foreign and domestic policies that are at the center of his agenda.
I think also this is where some Republican candidates are going to be facing headwinds that were not of their own creation, because the president has affirmatively gone into Iran, which has spiked gas prices unbelievably quickly. And we're hearing from the Trump administration those are not going to go back down under $4 a gallon for quite some time in terms of a national average. Also, the tariffs from the Trump administration have just quite simply driven prices up. So in a year when we know that inflation and the cost of living has been the top issue for voters across the board, the fact that the president has made some specific policy choices that have driven prices up in a way that is very, very painful for most people, not the ultra wealthy. At the same time, the president has been really focused on, in addition to the war in Iran, building a ballroom, building a new ark in Washington. I think it's just creating an image that is very uncomfortable for Republicans to feel like they're going to have the wind at their backs. It feels very much like they've got heavy, heavy headwinds that are created by the president when it really didn't have to be that way.
Yeah. And this is where the two AJC polls, we did one of Republicans, one of Democrats, really kind of speak to each other in weird ways. On the Republican side, voters are more optimistic about the direction of the country under Trump. The electorate is trying to decide which candidate can best carry forward that Trump-driven message, the Trump-era politics in Georgia. Democratic side voters are looking at the same political moment, seeing danger, instability, economic pressure, same state, same election year, very different mood to the electorate. Also, and this is something I'm writing about this week as well, but the one truism is the high number of undecideds. In this very strange political moment, you've got a third of Democrats still undecided about the governor's race. You've got a third of Republicans still undecided about their governor's race, with vastly more money spent, by the way, $100 million plus spent on that race. And then you've got more than half of the Republican electorate undecided on the Senate race. So, I look back at different polls, Patricia, and I compare this to the same poll we did at this stage in the 2022 race, where only 15% of likely Republican voters were undecided, right? So it was a different race, and Governor Kemp was an incumbent, but he still faced challengers with Abrams and of course, David Perdue on the right. But much more settled than this contest where there's so many voters who are still completely up in the air.
Yeah, it's such a puzzle. And one thing that I think is driving the high number of undecided voters is just the high number of candidates in these races. 6 Democrats running, there's actually about 20 Democrats running, but 6 named Democrats that we know of running in the governor's primary, GOP governor's primary, a number of top candidates running in the GOP governor's primary, and then Rick Jackson kind of comes barreling in at the 11th hour, 3 otherwise very strong candidates running in the GOP Senate race. And that speaks to the fact also that I think Georgia is seen as such a battleground. It is, both parties believe that they can win here. They believe that it's worth investing in. Candidates believe it's worth stopping their lives over, giving up their current jobs over in order to run, because they really think this is a year that is doable. That is so rare in a state for both parties to think that they could actually win, that it's just flooded voters with a whole lot of options. And I think also because it's just such a tumultuous time right now in American politics, it's hyper partisan, but it's also very unpredictable. And so it's very hard, I think, for voters to get their arms around who's going to be the best choice, who do I align with, also who's the most likely to win. I think these voters are highly driven by electability from a candidate, and they're really looking for that. I've spoken with a number of Democratic voters who support Keisha Lance Bottoms because they think she would be the most electable. They're like, is she my favorite candidate? No. Do I think she's the strongest in November because of her name ID, because of her ability to raise money? Yes, I do. So they're getting behind her. So it's that electability piece that so much anxiety in their minds could be answered by somebody who is elected in November. They just don't seem to know who that is.
So other than undecided and the sort of the mirror images we're seeing on the outlook for the economy, another thing that has really been a through line with these polls is artificial intelligence. We've got a huge supermajority of Democrats, about 80% of likely Democratic primary voters support more regulation of artificial intelligence. About 70% of likely Republican voters say the same. When asked specifically about data centers, would you approve or disapprove of the building of a data center in the community in which you live? About 52% of Republicans say they would either strongly or somewhat disapprove. That shows you where the Republican mentality is going on that. Among Democrats, it's even higher. It's almost 3/4, Patricia. So this just shows you that if there's one thing that you can unite Democrats and Republicans, MAGA warriors and MAGA haters, it is this sort of concern about where AI is taking us and this deep-rooted opposition, in some cases fervent opposition, to data centers in their backyards.
Yeah, and that is why I was really genuinely surprised that the legislature didn't do anything on data centers this year, because you see that anxiety all across the state in yard signs and community meetings, in candidates at the hyper-local level running only on data centers, saying, I will keep data centers out of this community, and I will tell you what's going on, by the way. So I think that the data center and the AI question represents just a huge level of anxiety for voters, and they feel out of control, and they don't feel like their leaders are listening to them. They don't want these in their backyards. Maybe they do want them in an industrial section of their city, and maybe those data centers could help pay some taxes and reduce the property taxes that they're paying. I mean, I think there's sort of like a conversation you could have where a data center is seen as more acceptable. But right now, the reality is they're popping up all over the place. In some cases, they are protected by NDAs. They're not negotiating with localities out in the open, and they are gobbling up all kinds of limited resources in terms of water, in terms of power. I think that was a huge part of what the PSC races were about, were just these galloping rates. And it feels like somebody somewhere, probably in California, is getting really rich with all these data centers, and it's coming at a cost to the communities in Georgia that people really treasure and value, and they don't want them to change. And if they do change, they want to know, why is it so important? And just nobody's talking to them. And I think it would be very smart for candidates to have an AI an AI policy and a data center proposal to take to them. I did see Jason Esteves at a data center community event over in DeKalb County, of all places. Yes, there are data centers coming to DeKalb County as well. And people are just the anxiety and the unknown and the why won't anybody listen to us? That's the vibe that you get. And you sort of layer it on top of sort of like the new oil barons are these AI tech companies, big tech, who have immense armies of lobbyists, and everybody just feels like their future is not their own.
We got to wrap in a second, but I never got a chance to debrief you because I missed that town hall. I was somewhere else on the campaign trail that night. What was the mood there, and what came out of it?
Well, the event was for Jason Esteves to hear from people, to hear their concerns and anxieties, and those concerns are very significant. I would say the lack of transparency was the biggest source of concern. The second source of concern, maybe it's a tie, is just the unknown of how many resources the data centers are going to require, and are local governments making promises to AI companies that it's going to be up to voters to keep? Are they going to have to pay the price for all these? Are they going to turn on their tap and it's running dry? And so Esteves was talking about sort of a balanced approach of, can you have sort of something that is economically beneficial for communities but not popping up in somebody's backyard? If you own a farm and now there's a data center next to you, the future of your farm is really in doubt, and people feel like it's just not fair.
I can promise you we're going to have a lot more coverage on that topic. That's going to do it for today's edition of Politically Georgia. If you've got a question about Georgia politics, you can call the Politically Georgia call-in hotline anytime, day or night. Leave your question. We'll play it back and answer it right here on the show during our Monday mailbag segment. The number is 770-810-5297. You can text, you can call, you can also email politicallygeorgia@ajc.com or patricia.murphy @ajc.com.
That's me.
And if you enjoyed what you heard, please follow, rate, and review us on your favorite podcast platform, and share Politically Georgia with a friend. We'll talk to you next time on the Politically Georgia podcast from the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. Thanks for listening to the Politically Georgia podcast. Our executive producer is Shane Backler. AJC's head of audio is Sam Stamler. Production support from our partners at Goat Rodeo, including Kara Schillen, Hazel Hoffman, and Max Johnston. For more of our political coverage, visit ajc.com/politicallygeorgia, and we invite you to support local journalism by subscribing to the AJC. Join us again next time on the Politically Georgia podcast from the Atlanta Journal-Constitution.